When the world pays attention to Chinese journalism, it's usually for the wrong reasons. The Paris-based press freedom group Reporters Without Borders ranks China as the 6th most repressive media environment in the world. So Chinese reporters and the outlets that they work for are routinely written off as mere government mouthpieces. The Communist Party does maintain a tight grip in most areas, but media production in China has exploded over the past 3 decades, and with that has come new competition for readers, viewers, and revenues. That has given rise to a new kind of investigative reporting. News outlets have found that, like anywhere else, exposing wrongdoing and unearthing the odd scandal or two can be good for business. Investigative reporting in China is not without its limits or its risks. But China is no longer the journalistic black hole it once was. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on the grey areas, and the reporters finding ways to produce some high-quality muckraking journalism in the world's largest one-party state.
In China, Beijing is the center for politics. In Shanghai, it's all about business. But if it's journalism you're after, Guangzhou is the place you want to be. The city is the capital of the province of Guangdong, and it's at the center of an ongoing experiment in investigative reporting. In 2008, an earthquake devastated Sichuan province. Reporters thronged the quake zone, but not only were they held back, some of them had their equipment confiscated.
They're trying to take the camera off of us right now.
However, investigative reporters, many of them from Guangzhou, broke news with stories of cheap construction, collapsed schools, and lives needlessly lost.
Guangzhou is quite a long way from Beijing, both geographically and politically. So there's a much more relaxed political atmosphere in the city.
The party secretaries in Guangdong tend to be willing to turn the other way and allow more bold reporting or news organizations to thrive.
In China, the best-selling newspaper is still the one published by the official state news agency, Xinhua. But publications from Guangdong are making their mark. Titles like Time Weekly, Southern Weekend, and Southern Metropolis Daily, which launched in 1997 and has been leading the investigative push.
The Southern Metropolis Daily did a lot of investigative reporting for the public, especially for the ordinary people whose rights were affected and hurted by the officials.
The paper's big story came in 2003 when it probed the case of Sun Jigang, a migrant worker in Guangzhou who was beaten to death in a state detention camp. The story had an impact at the highest levels of Chinese government, prompting Premier Wen Jiabao to order a change in the law.
But you know, in China, it's very risky to do the investigations about the policeman. It's a very sensitive topic. But the Southern Metropolis Daily decided to publish this story.
To do that was a very, very bold move, and as a consequence, Wen Jiabao had decided to abolish such, detention center, at least for people who didn't have proper ID.
For the global news audience, China's media policy is defined by its harsh treatment of journalists whose reporting is at odds with government narratives. The ban on Twitter and Facebook, Google's departure from the mainland due to censorship, and just this year, the expulsion of Al Jazeera's correspondent, Melissa Chan, the first expulsion of a foreign journalist in a decade. But China's media landscape has been undergoing a slow and steady transformation, mirroring that of the larger economy. Back in 1979, there were fewer than 70 newspapers, and their job was to deliver the Communist Party's message and showcase its work. Today, there are nearly 2,000 newspapers and 10,000 magazines, and the competition for readers and revenues is a big factor in pushing the limits of Chinese journalism.
From the 1980s onwards, increasingly advertising came to play its role. So you end up with a double incentive. One is to meet the political requirements, and on the other hand, to meet the commercial requirements.
You cannot recognize the media landscape in China nowadays. You see a lot of media organizations such as Phoenix Television are sending out reporters to do in-depth investigation because that's where they can increase their rating and draw their audience.
Investigative journalism broke new ground in 1992 when the state broadcaster CCTV launched a daily current affairs program called Focus. The broadcast zeroed in on corruption and official wrongdoing across China and proved a big hit. The hand behind this groundbreaking show was the Communist Party leadership. It saw investigative journalism as a way to keep a check on local officials.
When investigative journalism started to practice in China in 1990s, in fact, it was encouraged by the central government in order to meet its need to limit the power of the local governments.
But in that process, you have enterprising journalists, that really leverage that central directive to push the envelope, as we might say, to really do more than what maybe the central government intended.
One of the tactics journalists use to pursue sensitive investigations is called Yidi Jiandu, or cross-regional reporting. It takes advantage of a loophole in Chinese media regulations. Regional arms of the Communist Party have the right to control papers in their own province, but not reporters from elsewhere. This allows journalists to focus their investigative energies on stories outside their home province.
Propaganda department has no right, no power to control media from outside of town. So that makes cross-regional reporting possible. And that has created a huge space for investigative journalism.
And so what they do is they fly in to a place, they try to go in as quietly as possible, try to write up their story as fast as they can before any kind of ban or political pressure comes up, and then fly back home.
There are still, however, clear red lines for journalists, and most of them run through Beijing, straight to the doorstep of the central government.
They tolerate investigative journalism as long as it stays within certain limits. So there's a pragmatic acceptance on behalf of the Chinese authorities that if you've got journalists who know what the rules are and editors who know what the rules are, they feel that there's a system that they can work with. But journalists also understand that if they step outside those limits, then they may lose their jobs, and eventually newspapers could lose their license.
It's a test-error process, and you try to push the envelope, but there is a glass ceiling there. So there is a fine line you have to tread very carefully.
And that line is blurry, which means the boundaries are unclear. Remember that story about the migrant worker dying in a detention center? Just 11 months after the Southern Metropolis Daily published it, the paper's editor was arrested on allegations of corruption and jailed for 5 months. Beijing may have loosened the rules of reporting, but the journalists testing the limits are still paying the price.